In a rain-washed city, where glass towers mask the memories of neighborhoods they replaced, a billionaire named Adrian Hale arrives at a corner diner to sign the final papers that will raise a block of aging storefronts and build a luxury complex. Maya Rivera, a waitress with a past as a paralegal and a fierce loyalty to her community, recognizes a phrase in the contract that will trigger immediate evictions and a privatized playground clause. She leans across his table and whispers, "Don't sign that." What begins as a private reprimand becomes a public reckoning. Adrian's next move: refusing the deal's closing, offering to buy the block and transfer it to a community trust, and launching a radical plan for shared ownership, shocks the room, unsettles investors, and forces everyone to confront what power, responsibility, and redemption truly look like. The story is a cinematic, emotionally rich exploration of ambition, memory, and the possibility of making amends, told through dense sensory detail, layered characters, and a tense arc that brings the neighborhood, the billionaire, and the waitress to new definitions of belonging and hope. The rain had been talking to the city all day, an insistent, small, fisted percussion against windows and awnings that flattened colors into a watercolor of gray. Neon signs bled into puddles on the sidewalk, taxi lights became islands. The diner on the corner, chrome-edged, stubbornly warm, smelled of coffee and oil and the particular bleach of tablecloths that had seen better decades. Inside, it looked like a memory that refused to die: vinyl booths with cracked seams, a bar where the coffee machine hissed like a steam engine, a bulletin board where community flyers curled at the edges. Maya Rivera worked a double that night with an economy of movement she had spent years cultivating. She moved through the diner like wind through tall grass, attentive, unassuming, necessary. Her dark hair was pinned back in a way that made it look almost severe, and she wore a pen tucked behind her ear like a soldier's talisman. The diner was more than a job. It was a border between a life she had almost lost and one she had been building with careful hands. An affordable room in the back of an apartment building. An aunt's advice about thrift. A decade of late shifts stacking up into the kind of expertise a person only gains by standing long in the same place. He came in at 8:15, a man who wore a coat that seemed to know how to keep the rain off his conscience. Adrian Hale moved as if the world bent politely around him. He walked with the slow, assured stride of someone who had rehearsed success. His shoes were too expensive to scuff. His hair had a touch of salt at the temple that made him look both seasoned and attenuated, like an oak still standing after lightning. He sat at a corner booth with two others, a legal counsel, whose tie was a different shade of money, and a polished woman with an investor's smile. The kind of table that made customers glance away and lower their voices a half-degree. Maya brought waters and napkins in the small sanctuary of menace. She recognized him not because his face was on billboards. His face tended to be in business magazines and on the soft, focus pages that celebrated real estate conquests. But because his name was on the community boards, Hale Enterprises, she had watched the city change under acrid slogans like development and revitalization. Stores she'd known since she was a girl had been traded, folded, and sold like a deck of cards. There was a particular rent in her chest, the way a favorite sweater catches on a nail. The three of them spoke quietly at first, but business raises its voice the way thunder raises its head. Papers were produced in a thick bundle, their edges a clean geometry. The lawyer pushed a pen forward, a ceremonial baton. Adrian's fingers closed around it with the deliberateness of a man recording his authority on paper. Maya's tray rattled in her hands. She could have retreated. A waitress is trained to be invisible, to let rooms calibrate themselves without her interference. But she had been a paralegal in another life, years ago, before the economy had rearranged her. She had read contracts with the slow, life, weary patience of someone who had learned that a stray clause could mean someone's roof. That memory, like a stubborn ember, had never quite extinguished. She had scanned the paper across the table on a dare, and the letters had formed a small, poisonous truth, a fast, track demolition clause, an occupancy termination provision that would trigger immediate evictions, an easement that ceded a public square to private management under the corporate umbrella for 2 generations. She set the tray down too loudly, a small misstep that sounded like intention. The investor looked up, then down at her hands as if seeing a ghost. "Excuse me," she said, and the words came out like a shove. The lawyer's jaw ticked. Adrian's eyes narrowed in the way of a man accustomed to slight interruptions. Maya drew closer to the table and, without asking permission, slid the pages toward her. "Don't sign that," she said, low enough to be a warning and loud enough to be an accusation. Her voice did not tremble. It had the kind of firmness that comes from a person who has counted the cost of being quiet and decided to buy silence no more. The diner, which had huddled in its own small luminous bubble, felt the ripple of the moment. The man at the bar looked at a clock. The cook paused with a spatula in mid-air. 2 regulars at the far booth, a postal worker with flaking knuckles and a retired teacher who liked crossword puzzles, turned their heads in the same direction. Adrian's companions measured the interruption like a business metric: annoyance versus intrigue, the quick calculus of whether the employee should be disciplined or queried. Adrian's hands lay flat on the table, steady. For all the public image that preceded him, there was a private quality to his gaze that suggested someone who listened sometimes. Perhaps because listening had once been how he gathered intelligence. He leaned back a little and smiled the way a man smiles when he is deciding which impulse will win. "What are you talking about?" the lawyer asked, in the exact tone of someone who did not expect a useful answer. Maya tapped the contract, and the sound of the pen clattering to the table seemed to rally the room's attention. "That clause," she said. "Section 4C. It triggers immediate termination of occupancy without relocation compensation and waives community council rights. It also hands the city easement to your management trust for 30 years. Her fingers, quick with the syntax of law, pointed at the paragraph like a stake. "That playground. It becomes private. That childcare center. It's out. People will be out on the street within 45 days. A silence, taut as wire, stretched. The regulars in the booth resumed their coffee in small sips, as if afraid to break it. A child outside, carried against his parents' chest, made a tiny sound that flittered through the windows. Adrian did not bristle in the way of someone who had been surprised into anger. He folded his hands, and the lights above made a temporary map of his knuckles. The room waited. A man like him usually had obligations, shareholders, a board of directors, 1,000 small mechanisms that turned when he turned his hand. There would be emails to answer, an afternoon of meetings where no one would forget that he was the man who had built towers and bought neighborhoods. But there was also a private ledger in everyone he had hired to make the public ledger look neat. The ledger that kept his past, an ancestry of reasons, was less likely to be legible. The waitress had used law to reach him, and law has its own rhythm. "You used to be a paralegal," Adrian said after a time, stating the obvious the way someone will when they want to observe without interrogating. It wasn't a question. It was a recognition. Maya blinked. She felt the old, cautious delight that comes from being read correctly. "I was," she said. "Then, I am." "Why are you in a diner then?" the investor asked, as if tragedy or pathos must be discovered at once. Her smile was falsely warm, the kind corporate PR pens when they want to sound sympathetic. Maya's jaw hardened just enough. "Because I lost a job," she said. Because the firm folded after the mortgage crisis, and because I needed work that paid, and I needed to be near the people I care about. She did not name the families who depended on the neighborhood or the storefronts that had been their grandparents' livings. She didn't have to. Those things were visible in the wax floors and the faded flyers tacked to the glass. Adrian's face softened in a way she had not expected, not because he was impressed. At least she wasn't convinced it was that. But because his eyes, for a moment, looked toward a street she recognized in her own memory. Perhaps he had driven down this block before and not seen it. Perhaps he had watched it disappear into the rearview mirror of someone else's car. People like Adrian, she knew, had created distance between observation and consequence as a kind of currency. "You're right about the clause," he said. "We didn't mean for it to be deployed like that." His voice carried the soft cadences of apology, the kind practiced in late-night council rooms where people trade moral currency for legal loopholes. "Our drafts typically include an option for phased relocations and a tenant benefits package. That language, the language you just read, slipped in during the final edits. It might even be a holdover from an earlier investor's template." Maya kept her hands still. "The clause is active," she said. "It gives you legal standing to evict in 45 days and to turn the park into a private amenity. That's not a typo." Adrian's fingers found the pen again, but he did not reach for it. The lawyer opened his mouth, a practiced shark gape intended to swallow the moment. "There are stakeholders," he said. "Commitments. Shareholders expect returns. And what about the lives you are paying with those returns?" Maya interrupted. Her words carried a directness that trimmed the lawyer's usual hedging into something hollow. "You can't call this revitalization when it displaces people. You can call it whatever you want, but it's still removal." The diner felt like an audience chamber suddenly. Conversations resumed in the corners like murmuring rehearsals. The cook set a plate down as if it were a prop. A kid tapping on a game in a corner booth looked up, the blue screen reflecting in his pupils like a second shallow sky. Adrian stood up. He moved with a deliberateness that was different from the smooth arrogance of his arrival. He walked around the table and sat down opposite Maya. There was no boardroom now, no investor's shield between them. The booth made both of them the same height. The diner reduced their scale. "Tell me more," he said. She told him about families who kept cafes after hours because their afternoons were occupied with second jobs, about a teacher who housed migrant children at night when shelters were full, about the old man who had run the tailor shop for 30 years and who would likely not see his lease renewed. She spoke with honed detail that made each anecdote vivid. There were names and exact addresses and the smell of jasmine that came from a second-floor balcony in summer. The words evaporated into the steam of the coffee machine and collected in the corners of the room, like truth. "That clause is legal power," she said finally. "It's designed to make resistance expensive. It's the law's way of being cruel with a clean face." Adrian listened the way people listen, when the object is to understand. And understanding means more than sympathy. It requires discomfort. It requires that a man who had been taught to put numbers to everything learn to see the missing humans in an equation. "You're asking me to back out of a deal," he said. "To stand against my own board, my investors. You understand what that means." "I know what it means for them," she said. "I know what it will mean for you. But I also know what lasting development looks like. It's not just glass and marble. It's when people can stay and thrive and when the city isn't just a ledger you can rewrite without consequence." The investor. An investable sighed and rose to her feet with the quick, practiced exasperation of a person about to sanitize the scene. "This is why we let lawyers handle things," she said. Her voice was the kind that arranged disclaimers in advance. "Mr. Hale, these are standard procedures. We have obligations." Adrian leaned back and closed his eyes. For the first time since she had known his image, for the first time in a long time, he looked like a man who was making a choice in a moment that could not be undone by an email. The rain outside had turned the street into a silver ribbon, and the neon of a laundromat glowed in the reflections like a distant promise. He reopened his eyes and reached for the sheaf of papers. The click of the pen was a small metronome. The two patrons at the far booth pretended to read a crossword, but kept throwing glances like scant currencies into the table's economy. The cook leaned against the stove, arms crossed. The room had made space for a story. And Adrian did a thing no one expected. He folded the contract in half and placed it back inside its folder, then slid the folder to the center of the table. He looked at the lawyer, at the investor, at Maya. "I won't sign this today," he said. The words landed like a stone in a still pond. Their ripples traveled. "I won't sign any form that, in practice, displaces people within weeks. We will not purchase if our actions harm this community." The investor's mouth tightened into a clipped expression of incredulity. The lawyer's hand hovered near a phone, as if ready to call the head office. A general murmur rose. Heads turned. The man at the bar who had been fussing with his napkin forgot to fold it. A diner sat up straighter. The kid near the window looked as if he might believe in miracles for a second. "You can't just make a public, unilateral decision like that," the investor said, trying to cling to procedure. "Mr. Hale, there are contracts, deposits, timelines. We have fiduciary duty." "I understand fiduciary duty," Adrian said. He spoke with a quality that suggested he meant what he said, not as a rhetorical flourish but as a policy. "My fiduciary duty also extends to my conscience. I'm not running for cover behind a clause. If this development requires people to move without fair relocation and community input, then I won't be party to it." The lawyer coughed. "You understand the legal ramifications." "I'm not oblivious," Adrian replied. "I am aware of what this will look like publicly. I'm aware of the potential losses. I also understand that wealth is a tool, not a baton to beat neighborhoods into submission." His admission had a gravity that wasn't performative. It was not the Broadway apology that investors fear. It was the quiet of someone who had weighed a ledger and decided to subtract himself from a calculation that cost human beings their stability. Silence. Then the investor, with the precision of an optimist forced to salvage face, asked, "So what do you propose?" Adrian stared at the paper and then at Maya. "We buy the block," he said. "But we don't develop it in the way the contract dictates. We put it into a community land trust that I will fund and set up. We honor current leases until the market-driven end of their terms and offer relocation compensation where tenants choose not to stay. We create mixed-use models that include affordable units, a publicly accessible park, and below-market commercial spaces. Investors will have first refusal on green retrofit opportunities, but no evictions without due cause and relocation." Murmurs rose like a second tide. This was not the usual language of a man like him. There were caveats everywhere. The lawyer's brow knotted. The investor's lips pursed. "That's not how returns work," she said. "That reduces profitability." "Then find me a different role," Adrian said. "One that does not trade human beings for profit." Outside the window, a delivery van hissed its brakes and a puddle sloshed. A child on a bike splashed by and threw his head back with a laugh that felt like an echo of the promise Adrian had made and already began to feel the shape of. There was a way in which his refusal to sign the contract felt like a small suture to a city lung that had been hemorrhaging for years. The investor, who had seen the contours of deals and the ruin that sometimes followed dissent, stood and gathered her folder. "I'll have to speak to the board," she said. Her tone suggested that board speak might translate into a different kind of pressure. "This is irregular." Adrian rose to his feet and reached into his inner coat pocket. He produced a business card. Not the expensive kind that glitters, but a plain, understated card that had his name and a personal phone number. He pushed it across the table to Maya. "For what it's worth," he said simply. She looked at the card as if it were an offering and then at the man handing it. His palms were steady. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a show. It felt, to her, like permission. "I didn't come here to be thanked," she said. "I came because I hate the quiet that makes people small." "You did the right thing," he said. "Even if it's messy. Messy is the world's default state. Problems of human consequence rarely cleanly resolve like legal motions. Yet the crack of honesty that night opened a fissure through which light might eventually seep. For days, the transaction turned into rumor, then into a headline that the investor corps enjoyed parsing for the moral lesson they could commodify. Hale Enterprises released a brief statement. Adrian Hale had asked for more time to consider community impact. It was a press release compromise, neither a surrender nor a victory. But words were small currency against the fact of him walking into a diner, folding a contract, and refusing a signature. The board reacted predictably. There were angry letters, veiled threats of replacement, and a quick, efficient attempt to remind Adrian of obligations with numbers and the cold measures of law. Yet the community, fed up with being the collateral of progress, rallied. A local organizer, Luis, who ran an after-school program, launched a petition. The tailor, Mr. Santos, taped a flyer in the diner window that read, "Hale walked in. We spoke. We stay." The negotiation that followed was ugly in places and startlingly humane in others. Adrian accepted bracing resistance from his investors, who did not understand why he would risk capital on ethical redistribution. He walked into meeting rooms where men in suits tried to translate his sentiments into spreadsheet models. He listened to activists and straightened when injustices were outlined with a bluntness he had not been taught to hear. He brought legal teams and community advocates together in rooms that smelled of coffee congealed in the bottom of paper cups. He walked the block and sat on stoops with women who had lived through wars of rent and celebrated minor victories like repaired window panes. Maya went from waitress to reluctant liaison. The investiture was never formal. The community trusted her because she had told the truth in the diner and because she carried intimacy with the neighborhood like a flag. She organized listening sessions in the diner after hours, scribbled notes on napkins, and sketched with Adrian the outlines of a trust whose language would prevent the quick erasure of the people who had lived here for decades. She was not a CV or a title on a website. She was a living historical record. The climax came a week later in a town hall that filled the community center to bursting. String lights hung like low satellites. Chairs were squeezed between tables laden with potluck staples. People who had never spoken in public lined up to tell their stories. A mother who feared losing her son's school commute. An elderly seamstress whose hands trembled when she thought of unpaid rent. A teenager who wanted to know if his future would include the job training he hoped for. Investors were present, too, in their quiet way, attentive, skeptical, mobile phone screens bright as little sunrises. The city had sent a representative who had the air of a man who had been instructed to keep the peace while not impeding the pipeline of developments. Cameras from a local news station fit into the doorway like flies into amber. Adrian stood at the podium with the firmness of someone who had reinvented his purpose in a week. He did not bring speeches of corporate platitude. He brought a plan and an admission. "We could do the usual thing," he said, voice steady but not booming, which is to speak about returns and tax breaks and mixed-use optimization. or we can make a different decision. Tonight, I will put forward a legal offer to purchase the block with a clause that allows the community land trust to hold title. I will fund the initial trust endowment. I will ensure that current leases remain in place. I will create a co-ownership board that includes residents, small business owners, and representatives from the city. I will step down as a unilateral decision maker on this parcel and accept a role as a financial steward only. The room inhaled collectively. There was a low sound, like the earth shifting. Among the crowd, the investor who had been at the diner looked at her phone, as if measuring the financial temperature. Her lips trembled with a practical grief. The lawyer who had pushed the original contract read his notes, as if preparing to argue a new history. The city rep cleared his throat and then nodded, wordlessly signaling that at least one branch of government might back the plan. Lewis stood up and spoke for 10 seconds that felt like 10 lifetimes. "We need guarantees," he said. "We need real legal teeth that stop speculation. If you leave us with words, we will be right back here in 5 years." Maya glanced at Adrian. He did not falter. "I will sign those guarantees," he said. "I will put them in the trust documents. I will waive any right to challenge the trust community-focused bylaws." When the legal team whispered their doubts, Adrian answered them in a way that shocked a few with its bluntness. "If my board wants to remove me, let them. I'll sell personal holdings and fund the trust privately if necessary. I will not profit from the displacement of these people." The investor from the diner left that night and would, later, call it a chapter in her career she would not prefer to revisit. But for the community, the announcement was seismic. Here was a promise backed by weightier measures than a PR statement. Plans were drawn, lawyers debated clause verbiage until heads ached, and nights were spent in the community center drafting bylaws that would lock in protections. The stunned room, the diner, the town hall, press rooms, had to reckon not only with Adrian's action, but with why it had startled them. It had stunned because wealth had been used in a manner the world seldom expected as a tool to emancipate rather than to dominate. It had stunned because a woman with a pen behind her ear had spoken truth to power and been heard. It had stunned because someone who had been trained in obedience, a waitress, had become the person whose knowledge realigned the axis of a negotiation. The resolution arrived like most things of consequence slowly, with missteps and minor betrayals, and with small, careful victories. The trust was established, the bylaws prevented forced evictions, and required a high bar for any future changes. Some investors withdrew, their spreadsheets unable to accommodate human contingencies. Others stayed, their portfolios reimagined with a margin for social impact. A few businesses took advantage of grants to retrofit storefronts while hiring locally. Mr. Santos continued cutting suits, now with a second apprentice who had been a high school dropout, but had learned to thread a needle and mend a seam. Louis expanded his after-school program into a community employment hub. For Maya, the change was both practical and intimate. She became the trust's liaison and was offered a modest stipend and an office in the refurbished block where the community center had been poorly kept before. She declined many offers of titles and instead insisted on a role she could live in, listening, mediating, teaching. The diner continued to hum in its own small universe, but with a new glow. Her shift now felt larger, like a bridge stretched across a river. For Adrian, the victory was not uncomplicated. Board members whispered in hallways that he was naive. The stock took a small dip and then stabilized because markets are clever at accounting for values in the long term. He did not become saintly. There were nights he sat awake thinking about the money he had once seen as an engine and now saw as a responsibility that pinched his chest with tender weight. He traveled less for a while, sat more in community rooms, and learned the texture of neighborly politics the way one learns a new language. He also learned to take advice from people who had no reason to flatter him. And of course, there were bromides that the press loved, the powerful man humbled by the people, the waitress who taught a billionaire humility. They were true in parts and false in others. The truth was porous, more interesting. Maya was not a moralizing angel. She had her faults. Stubbornness that sometimes bordered on rigidity, a sarcasm that could wound. And Adrian was not purely repentant. He had history that complicated redemption. But there was a mutuality that emerged, a billionaire who had once measured the world in returns, learning to measure it in relationships, and a waitress whose voice carried weight because she would not shrink from the people she loved. Years later, when the block hummed with a new kind of life, cafes with co-op windows, a playground with a mural painted by neighborhood kids, mixed-use units where balconies held laundry lines in cheerful defiance. The diner became a pilgrimage of a softer sort, a place where stories were told, agreements signed, and crumbs of bread shared. People who once feared displacement now had small reasons to stay. The trust had its own board composed of long-term residents and new professionals who had learned to hold the past and future in the same hand. On an afternoon, when the sun pushed the gray away, Adrian stopped by the diner. He sat at the same corner booth where he had once nearly signed a paper that would have undone lives. Maya poured coffee into a chipped ceramic mug and slid it across the table as if closing a loop. He looked at her and, without the press or the cameras or the borders, touched the place where a pen had once rested. "People still tell that story," he said, "about the waitress who told me not to sign." Maya shrugged, a small smile tracing her lips. "You still had to listen." He laughed then, a clean sound that belonged to a man who had learned the difference between hearing and understanding. He stood then, hand on the back of the booth, and nodded to the room that had witnessed a tiny revolution. He walked out into sunlight that made puddles into mirrors, and the city, for once, looked like a place that had room for the things people loved as well as the things they built. The stunned room had settled into a steadier hum. It had been stunned into consciousness, into a conversation it had not known it needed. The diner kept serving coffee, the trust kept guarding the block, and the people, each in their imperfect, human way, continued the work of being a neighborhood that refused to be measured only by its market value.